Welcome, Levo community, to a very special office hours behind the scenes on the set of House of Cards with none other than Academy Award winner Kevin Spacey. We're really thrilled to have him.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here. This is maybe the first time I've ever actually been in office hours.
There's a first for everything.
I don't work office hours, so this is a first.
Well, thank you so much for being here. We'd love to explore a few things with you today. We really are looking forward to our community learning from your illustrious career and your outlook on everything from taking the long view to mentorship, which we know is near and dear to your heart with the Kevin Spacey Foundation. But we'd love to start just getting to know you a little bit and then go into that.
Right.
So we'll start with a few rapid fire questions just so we get warmed up. So favorite color?
Red.
Oh, that's a good one. I almost wore red. Damn it. Coffee or tea?
Coffee, although lately a lot of tea. I've been fighting a little throat thing, so actually lately a lot of tea.
Okay.
And tea with whiskey.
Excellent.
By the way.
That was my next question.
I also hear that I can say fuck.
You can.
So fucking whiskey.
Okay. Even better than normal whiskey. Yeah. What keeps you going? We talked about this a little bit before we got started here, but I would love if you could share it with the camera as well. What are the things that motivate and keep you going?
What keeps me going? I'll tell you a little story that I kind of love because it helps illustrate my philosophy about what gets me out of bed in the morning and what I think is a really valuable thing for people to think about. There was a great film director named John Huston. John Huston, people might remember him as the Faye Dunaway father character in Chinatown. Okay. But he was also a great film director and the father of Angelica Houston and the son of Walter Houston. So it's a long history of sort of Hollywood greats in the Houston family. And he directed a film down in Puerto Vallarta called Night of the Iguana. And it starred Ava Gardner and I think Burt Lancaster, and there were lots of people down there. I believe Frank Sinatra was there because of Ava Gardner, and Truman Capote was down there, and Elizabeth Taylor was down. All these people were down there. And they had this dinner one night on the beach. And everyone sat around this table and they were having this wonderful dinner. And they decided to play a game. And the game was that you had to describe the most important thing in life only using one word. So they went around the table and you got health, wealth, family, money. Came back to John Huston and he said interest. Huh. Interest. That's the most important thing in life. And I feel very much that's something that I've adopted, that the idea of being interested in things I don't know rather than things I do know, peeling back the layer again and again, putting yourself in situations that are challenging and new, compelling, and ask of you something different than you've ever done before. And sometimes that means things that scare you and things that you're not sure you can succeed at. I suppose it's one of the reasons why I've always loved the theater and why I love doing plays almost over anything else. Mm-hmm. Because it's a bit like, there's a ritual to it, but there's also this incredible thing about it where it's like you're walking on a tightrope. And you don't want the audience ever to think you're going to fall off, but for you, walking on that rope, feeling like you have nothing below you but your faith in what you're doing, your appreciation of perhaps the words and the story that the author has written, and your trust in your fellow company members. And it's a little bit like I've often compared theater for people that don't understand it or think it must be boring or it's the same thing every night. I go, well, if you went out every night and you played tennis every single night, you did 8 nights of doing tennis, right? Yes, it's the same rules, but it's a different game every time you're out on that court. Right. You're working on a different part of your game. And there's a kind of immediacy and a feeling that it's alive and it's constantly changing and growing. It's a living organism. Mm-hmm. Whereas in film or television, no matter how good an actor might be, they'll never be any better. Right. And in theater, I can be better next week than I was this week. I can be better in 2 weeks. Right. So it's this constant sense of wanting to propel myself forward, to walk through doors I haven't walked through before, that keeps me interested. And that, for me, is what gets me out of bed in the morning.
What are you particularly interested in right now? What are your new passions? What are those new fears that you're working on?
It's a very interesting period in my life because I've just about to end what has been a kind of remarkable experience of, I moved to London 11 years ago to start a theater company at a 200-year-old wonderful Victorian theater called the Old Vic. Mm-hmm. And literally started the company from the ground up. I wasn't replacing somebody who was an artistic director. We started this company from the ground up, and now we're just celebrating the beginning of our 11th season of work, and it's been the most I'd never run a company before. I never had a staff. Now we've got about 75 on staff, and a front of house crew and a backstage crew, and all the companies of actors that come in. We've done about 45 main stage productions, a huge educational department, a great program that we do, which is about mentoring emerging talents called Old Vic New Voices, in which lots and lots of incredible emerging actors and writers and directors and producers have gone through and have now become the next generation of artists that are doing incredibly well. It's always exciting when I get the breakdown of those that have gone through our program. But I'm now coming to the end of that. I made a 10-year commitment. I'm going one more year longer than I had thought, so this is my 11th season. And I will give up the reins of the Old Vic next August. So suddenly, there's a number of things that have sort of happened as I begin to wind down my role at the Old Vic. First, it really required me to live in London full time. Mm-hmm. I mean, it wasn't, sometimes people said to me, so do you commute? And I'm like, no, you can't really run a theater and commute. So I really picked up my life at a time when I probably could have just kept making movies. Mm-hmm. But again, the theater is hugely important to me. I also wanted to do something new and different that would ask of me something outside of my own ambition and outside of my own experience that I'd had up to that point. And as now I'm sort of looking down the barrel of leaving, there's all kinds of things that I am interested in doing and different roads I want to go down and things that I just simply didn't have the time for in the last 11 years because I was so dedicated to the work of the Old Vic. In fact, I do this television series now called House of Cards. It's the first job that I have taken since I started the Old Vic that took me away from the Old Vic for more than 8 weeks. I made a vow to myself that I would never take a job that took me away for longer than 8 weeks. And weirdly, there were only 2 jobs in the first 9 seasons at the Old Vic that took me away for that period of time. But House of Cards has taken me away for a longer period of time, but it's also been sort of almost the right time for the company to start to get used to the idea that I'm not going to be around all the time, that there'll be a new artistic director who will start when I finish. So music is hugely important to me. I'm very interested in getting into doing some books. So there's all kinds of new things that I sort of see on the horizon that I will now have a little bit of time now to dedicate myself to, now that I don't have the full-time job of the Old Vic.
So I love your experience with respect to the Old Vic because it combines your artistic endeavors and the idea of really founding something from the ground up, scaling an organization. It's sort of a different approach. Yeah. So what did you learn about immersion or what did you learn around entrepreneurship with your experience at the Old Vic? Well,
it was a really interesting challenge because for people that don't know, the Old Vic is a theater that has been world-renowned. Mm-hmm. John Gielgud made his debut on the Old Vic stage in 1928. Laurence Olivier and Ralph Richardson ran the Old Vic in the 1940s. Judi Dench made her debut on the Old Vic stage right out of drama school in the early 1960s. Ian McKellen, Anthony Hopkins. Mm-hmm. Then Laurence Olivier started what is now the National Theater, which is in its own facility now on the South Bank, but it lived and was built at the Old Vic over 14 seasons until they moved to their own building. And from that point, about 1976, when Laurence Olivier was about to hand over the reins of the National Theater to Sir Peter Hall, the Old Vic just sort of became a place you could rent. Mm-hmm. There were a number of attempts where directors came and tried to start theater companies or had relatively successful companies for a couple of seasons, but for about 30 years, the Old Vic was no longer on the map. It was a place that had no longer become a destination for audiences. There was no educational program. There was no outreach program. There was no community work. There certainly wasn't the thing that we created called Old Vic New Voices. So when I took on the challenge of saying we're going to start a theater, There was both the artistic challenge of what do you put on the stage? How do you get audiences to come back to this 1,040-seat theater that receives no public subsidy whatsoever? And I have to put that in context. The National Theatre receives £17.5 million a year. The Dunmar Theatre, which Sam Mendes created and ran for 10 years, receives a good portion of funding from the government. The Royal Court receives a good deal of funding. The Almeida receives a good deal of funding. The Old Vic receives nothing. So there were a number of challenges. How do you create a program that starts to get audiences back into that theater? How do you economically make that work? And we had to come up with an economic model that was quite new and different. But at the same time, we had to compete with the West End in terms of our ticket prices and other things. So all kinds of ways in which I started to look at and say, both to my beginning to staff up the theater, we're not going to do it the way that people might expect us to do. I'm not going to go for public subsidy because I don't want to rely on public subsidy and then find out the next election when a new party gets in power, and the very first thing that most governments do is they start cutting the arts and culture.
Right.
And then what do? Let's see if we can run a major British institution without subsidy. Let's see if we can start to get people into this theater who have never come into this theater before. So I created a ticket policy right from the get-go, and we didn't have any funding for this, and I told my board it would probably cost us money to get the numbers to be able to prove to someone it was worth funding, and we ultimately did that. But in the first number of years, I had a policy which was that at every single performance of every single play we ever did, 100 of our seats were set aside for young people under the age of 25. So for £12, you could sit in our front row. I made the front row student seats as well as all over the theater, not in the back behind a pillar.
Right.
Because I think that bringing young people into the theater and saying that it's affordable, it's accessible, we want you here, we want you to experience it, and we're going to give you great seats, actually affects the whole experience. It affects the actors, who are happy not to have somebody falling asleep in the front row because they're so excited. Kids are so excited to be that close. But I also think it affects the audience that come in quite often, frankly. People are dragged to the theater at 7 o'clock and they're thinking, what the fuck am I doing in this fucking play? And I didn't want to be here. And then they see all these young people and they're like, oh, maybe this is a little hipper than I thought. Right. So that's a policy that we did, and it's been hugely successful. I believe that we have managed to bring in over 100,000 young people.
Wow.
Have seen our productions in the last 10 seasons. You know, I would say that there's a lot of people who had an attitude about it that if we didn't put on Shakespeare, Ibsen, Shaw, Chekhov, we were somehow not being true to this theater's classic history. But my feeling was, if we only appeal to an already theater-going audience, and we don't do things that are going to be surprising and different and that you wouldn't expect to see on the Old Vic stage, we're not going to reach out to a broader, more diverse, and younger audience, which is what I wanted to do. So we started to do stuff that, frankly, we came under a lot of criticism for from the critics. And I always remember, you know, no matter how tough it got, and there were calls for my resignation, and there was lots of stuff in the press about what a terrible job I was doing in the first 2 seasons. I kept saying to our staff and to everyone that was coming on to work with us, look, we have to recognize that there are going to be people who have very, very strong opinions about what we should be doing, but we're not in the business of satisfying those people. And in fact, I used to say this all the time, if we brought all the critics together, they wouldn't fill 1 row. And we have to fill a lot of rows in this theater. We have to bring a lot of people into this building. So we'll take some heat, but we have to keep our heads high. We have a 10-year vision. And when you're trying to build something that's going to last, because the most important thing for me was, I want this theater to continue as a producing house long after I'm gone. I don't want it to just be successful while I'm there. And I don't want it to be associated only with me. I am one of many custodians of this remarkable space that over time have stood up for it and fought for it and been there for this incredible cultural institution. And so that's what we did. We took a lot of criticism and we kept our heads high. And here we are, having just celebrated the opening of our 11th season of work, and Matthew Warchus, who is a brilliant theater director, although he just directed a film called Pride, which has just been nominated for a whole bunch of independent awards in Great Britain, and I suspect people will be hearing about it. It's going to be released in the United States. He directed me in Speed the Plow that I did with Jeff Goldblum. He directed our trilogy of plays, The Norman Conquests. He directed Matilda on Broadway, which is this big musical. He is taking over my role as artistic director, and he's committed for 6 seasons. And so what I set out to do, which was to make sure that this theater continued long after I was gone, is actually happening.
I love that. And the advice that you have as well about how to engage a new generation of customers, of people who are really passionate about something that might have had a long-standing tradition, really applies to organizations today that are adapting to a new generation of people who have different expectations, who are technology savvy in a different way, and who are learning what to love.
Here was an interesting thing that we also did when we started. I brought on a guy named Steve Winter, who I had heard had done some incredible work in education at a theater called the Tricycle Theater in London. So I headhunted him and I stole him. And he now, by the way, runs my foundation. So he's left the Old Vic, but we worked together for 10 years at the Old Vic. And I remember, people won't know, but the Old Vic is 2 blocks away from Waterloo Station on Waterloo Road in the Cut. And if you were standing in front of the Old Vic and you could make the Old Vic disappear and you just looked around the neighborhood, you were surrounded by low-income housing. It used to be Catholic housing. It's estate housing. And I brought Steve out there one day when I first brought him onto the theater, and I said, Steve, I want you to just go around and knock on every single council door. I want you to just take a kind of informal survey. How many people who live within spitting distance of this theater have ever been inside of it? And so he went around, knocked on all these doors, came back and said 98% of the people I spoke to who live within a block and a half of this theater have never been inside. And I said, why? And he said, well, much of the attitude is, what does that have to do with my life? And, oh, you mean that place where all those rich people go at 7 o'clock? So we began a program as well, which was that if you lived within the neighborhood, you could come and see our productions for free or for £5 if you were in Lambeth. We brought their children into our workshops. And suddenly, the Old Vic, which had been a world-renowned theater and all these famous people had worked there, started to be what it also should be, which is a community theater. And suddenly, within about 2 or 3 years, I'd walk down the street and people in the neighborhood would go, hey, Kevin, my daughter went to that workshop you had about the makeup thing, doing the thing, and it was great, and thank you so much. We started to, and I suppose maybe in the early years even when the National Theater was there, the notion of doing community work was, well, if the fucking community shows up, that's our job.
Right.
But I felt our job was bigger than that and should be bigger than that. We were the first theater that ever did a community theater project with the Imperial War Museum, which is a remarkable facility about 5 blocks away from the Old Vic. We created a play that was about the Battle of the Somme in World War I. And we cast about 75 people from within the community. There were only 5 professional actors in it, and the rest of the cast was from the community. We discovered under Waterloo Station these kind of remarkable original Victorian tunnels that at the time had been used for many, many years as storage for Eurostar. But then the Eurostar moved to another train station, and there were these empty tunnels. So I managed over a period of time to convince the rail companies and Waterloo Station to allow us to take over these Victorian tunnels, and we created theater. We call them the Old Vic Tunnels, and we did theater, site-specific theater, and we did a lot of community projects in the Old Vic Tunnels. They're no longer open anymore, but for 3.5 years we did some work that I wouldn't put up on the Old Vic stage, but we did it in the Old Vic Tunnels, and it was really cool. So we started to do stuff that had never been done, and we really started to, I think, take a better sense of responsibility about our role as a community theater.
How do you personally cultivate your creativity through all these projects? How do you keep your mind fresh?
Drugs help, and coffee is very helpful. You know what it is? Part of it is that you have to surround yourself with people who are not just of a like mind, but of a nimble spirit, and who bring you incredible ideas. You know, I rely on a tremendous amount of people who come to me and say, what about this idea? What about that? Mm-hmm. And sometimes, you know, a little germ of an idea can grow and grow and grow. I mean, actually, the funny way that we discovered the Old Vic tunnels was completely by accident. There's an artist that's becoming fairly well known in the United States, but in Great Britain, hugely famous, although no one knows what he or she looks like, and that's a person named Banksy. Banksy started his work, or her work, but I think he's a he, doing all kinds of stencil drawings all over neighborhoods, and started to become very, very famous. Now his work sells for hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars. And anyway, so we were told to look out for something that Banksy might be doing around Waterloo next spring, they said to us in this one year. So one day I'm in my office and my assistant comes in and says, Kevin, what are you doing? And I said, I've got this meeting and I've got to read this play. And he said, well, just come with me. And I said, what, now? And he said, yeah, come with me now. So we walked down the Lower Marsh, which is just adjacent to the Old Vic. And underneath Waterloo Station, there's always been about 150-foot taxi tunnel where the taxis used to come in and out to pick people up for the Eurostar. It was now no longer being used for that. And yet, when I turned the corner, and normally it would be the tunnel, it was all boarded up, and there was a big sign that said closed for important maintenance. And it looked like an official sign. And there was a guy at this door that they'd built. And so he unlocked this thing, and he let us in. And we walked in, and what had happened was Banksy had brought in about 82 brilliant stencil artists from all over Europe. And they took over this tunnel. And there were all these incredible art exhibitions that were happening. And literally all the artists were in there painting and doing this. And it was going to be open to the public in a couple of days. But we got this early view of it. So we're walking through this remarkable, very lengthy taxi tunnel. And it's just been transformed into this extraordinary space. But there were all these doors that were open. And they had their paint cans in there. And that's where they were having lunch. And I kept looking down. I said, what's in there? And they said, oh, those are the old Victorian tunnels. And I said, well, what are those? They go, well, in World War II, when the bombs went off, that's where people went, and that's where, during the plague, all the bodies would go. Those are the original train tracks. Now they've got the train tracks above, so we were in the basement, the original tunnels. And I said, well, what are they now? And they said, well, they used to be storage for Eurostar, but now they're nothing. And I said, well, can I go in? And they went, well, it's completely dark, and it's wet, and it's dangerous. And I said, well, I have my phone, and can I use my flashlight? So literally went into these dark, damp places, and within 10 minutes I knew this is an incredible performance space. And so, as I say, we managed to develop it into something that was quite remarkable. So again, happy accidents that can happen if you just are, you know, paying attention and interested. Great. Same word. Yeah.
How do you think about taking risks?
I love taking risks. I've sort of been doing it my whole life. You know, there's this word now that's sort of become a catchphrase word now. It's called disruption and chaos, and we hear that a lot now in certainly the world of the internet. But I look back and I remember when I was in junior high school, and all of my friends in junior high school were going to a particular high school, and I was like, yeah, I had a great time with all my friends in junior high, but I kind of want to have a different experience. So I decided to go to a different high school, and I did. And then 2 years after that, I was sitting in a theater watching a high school production of a play called The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie. And my high school had also been chosen in this festival to represent high school theater with 3 plays that were chosen. I was performing hours the next day on this very stage. But on this night, watching this production of Brodie, I was watching 2 actors whose work I had known from theater festivals. And I remember thinking to myself, gosh, I want to transfer to that school. I want to work with these 2 actors so bad. And those actors' names were Val Kilmer and Mare Winningham. Mare went on to has had an incredible career, as well as Val. And then the next day we did our production. I was doing a production of a play called All My Sons. And I had these 2 things that happened in the course of doing this play this day. The first was that during the performance, it was the first time that I actually realized in the performance that I no longer wanted to be an actor. I was an actor. I realized it in this performance. There was something that was happening between me and the audience in which I felt I was having an effect on them because of the character I was playing, not because it was my parents who were coming to see me or my friends who were making fun of me or being the center of attention. There was something happening in which I was portraying a character and the audience was reacting to it. And I remember after the curtain call, I sat down in the chair backstage and I was sort of just thinking about what that meant. What that meant. Maybe that meant I could actually have a career. Maybe I should do this for a living. And this man walked up to me and he said, hello. And I said, hello. And he said, my name is Robert Corelli. And I knew who Robert Corelli was. He was the drama teacher at Chatsworth High, which had done that play I'd seen the night before. And he said, I just wanted to tell you that was an incredible performance that you just gave. And I know I probably shouldn't be saying this, but I'd like you to transfer to my school. And I was like, are you a mind reader? And so in my 11th grade, I transferred to Chatsworth High School for my 12th grade senior year. And I did The Sound of Music with Mare Winningham. I played Captain Von Trapp. She played Maria. And it is true that during one performance, she became very ill and barfed into my captain's hat. And it's not the first time that someone's become violently ill over my performance. But anyway, and I did plays with Val, and we did festivals, and then later on I would follow Val to the Juilliard School where I studied theater. So those kinds of moves were, at the time, I mean, you can imagine I was being called a traitor by my friends because I wasn't going to the same high school they were going to, and I transferred to another high school after that, and I was being called a traitor by those people. But I knew that I had to make a change, that I had to take that risk if I wanted to get better. And I wanted to challenge myself, and I wanted to get better parts. And so I've been doing it my whole life. And so it's actually, I don't want to say it's comfortable, but I'm not afraid of it because there are so many times I've done it where it turned out to be the right thing. It turned out to be the right thing for me.
Do you feel that taking risks becomes easier and easier over time as you accustom yourself to feeling that way?
I don't think you ever stop feeling afraid. It's like every time I have to give a performance, I mean, you should see me backstage before the first preview of a play. Fucking a nightmare. Because you're about to share your baby.
Right.
You know, it's one thing to be in a rehearsal room where you're safe and you trust each other, and then suddenly one night you're in front of 1,000 people and you have to now, is this going to work? Are they going to like it? Is it going to get a laugh? I don't know. So there's a kind of heartbeat that is very, very rapid. But over time, you learn to deal with that better. It's not that it goes away. You just learn to deal with it better. And the more you do it, the more you stand up, the braver you get about being able to stand up. And I have these kind of experiences where when I do workshops with young people, and it's not about whether or not they want to go into the arts, because if a person wants to go into the arts, you're not going to be able to stop them, right? But it's about seeing also what can happen to somebody when you use theater and its artists as a tool and as a way to try to help somebody with their own sense of self-esteem and their own sense of collaboration and how they feel about themselves and their confidence. And I've watched it innumerable times because I recognize it, because I was that kid. I was the shy kid in the corner. I'll tell you the story about basically where my philosophy about all of this started, which is that I was in junior high. I had a very perceptive drama teacher who had guided me into this drama class and then guided me toward a workshop, because at the time in California there was a tremendous amount of money in schools for arts programs. And one of the things we did was we got to go and see professional actors do productions, and we got to do workshops. And one of these productions we went to see was a production that was happening at the Mart Taper Forum of a play called Juno and the Paycock, which is a Sean O'Casey play. And it was starring Walter Matthau, Maureen Stapleton, and Jack Lemmon. And Jack Lemmon happened to be one of my idols. And for people that don't know who Jack Lemmon is, Some Like It Hot, The Apartment, China Syndrome, Missing, Glengarry Glen Ross, which I happen to have done with him. But at the time, I was a shy kid who had a dream about maybe wanting to be an actor. And I'm in this workshop, and we had to do scenes, and so I did a scene. And at the end of that scene, Jack Lemmon walked up to me, and he put his hand on my little 13-year-old shoulder, and he said, "That was your touch of terrific." He said, "No, you're a born actor. I'm serious. You should go to New York and study because you were meant to do this for your life." And to be given that kind of acknowledgement and praise as a 13-year-old is almost like life-changing. And I did go to New York after school, and I did study. And then ultimately I ended up getting an opportunity to audition to play Jack Lemmon's son in a Broadway production of a Eugene O'Neill play called Long Day's Journey into Night, and I got the role. And I was 26 years old. And I spent the next year working with Jack every single night. He became the most important mentor and father figure and friend that I could have hoped to have had as I was beginning my career in the business of being in the entertainment business. And we ended up doing 3 films together. Glengarry was the last one, which he used to love to call Gene Barry Glenn Close, because it was easier to say. And Jack had this philosophy that I've now adopted as my own, and is essentially the slogan for my foundation, which is, he said, if you've done well in the business that you wanted to do well in, then it is your obligation to spend a good portion of your time sending the elevator back down. And so that's why the logo for my foundation is the universal button we push to send the elevator up. So Jack's kind of always around.
What advice do you have for our viewers who are in positions of being mentored or who are starting to mentor themselves? What have you learned, or what advice do you have for them to be effective in doing that and sending the elevator back down?
You know, there's so many ways that you can do it. I see it very, very often in this way, because it happened to me. Sometimes an adult or even a friend Do you think it's an alarm, or do you think it's a jackhammer? By the way, you're going to hear a jackhammer from now on. It's not an alarm, which I thought it might have been, but it's a jackhammer. We're gonna work through it. Sometimes it can be a very, very tiny but incredibly important thing. A person of influence, an adult, a teacher, a mentor, can just say the right words to someone at exactly the right moment when they need to hear it. And it can be life-changing. And I've had innumerable experiences now in workshops when I'm working with younger people, and where I just see that they just need someone to say just something that encourages them. And sometimes that's all it is. Sometimes also there's other ways to mentor, which is about being there and trying to help in whatever way you can. I'm always talking to people about, they go, well, what could I do? And I go, well, every community has a community theater. Every community has a place that you can go, right, where they do all kinds of things, and they might need somebody who can type. They might need somebody who can Xerox something. So it doesn't always have to be big things. Obviously, money is very often a barrier for someone getting through. But I think there's lots and lots of ways that we can be encouraging and mentor younger people starting out. But there also, in many ways, there should be no age barrier, because emerging talent can be any age. So we do a lot of things through the foundation that are grants that we do. We're also doing scholarships to some of the better, finer arts institutions, so that people can go through their schooling very often for free. That certainly wasn't the case when I went to Juilliard. I had 3 jobs and I was on 2 scholarships, and and obviously things have become even more expensive now than they were when I was in school. So there's lots of ways in which you can help people. But I think mostly it's a feeling and an attitude, and you have to pay attention to what's going on in front of you, and you have to look at the person in front of you, because it's always very specific and very unique, and And that person is sometimes crying out for someone to notice that they really want to participate, but they don't know how. I mean, I constantly am looking for the shy person in the corner of a workshop who's like, and you can see that they want to be engaged, but they're terrified, and you got to slowly coax them out, slowly, like, why don't you get up and do something? Oh, no, come on, why not? I had this really incredible moment. I was in the Middle East, and I had insisted this workshop. I'd been in another country, and I'd been told that I shouldn't expect any women in this workshop, and then 13 women showed up in this workshop, and I was like, oh, that's interesting, out of 27. And then the next place I was going to, which was Abu Dhabi, I said, all right, I'll do a workshop there, but only if the entire workshop is women. So it was. And many of them were wearing burqas, and there was this one girl in the corner who was that, you could see that she wanted to be involved, but she was just terrified. So we took a little break and we came back, and I said, who's going to be next? How about you? And she went, no. And I said, why not? She goes, I don't know any Shakespeare. And everyone was sort of preparing Shakespeare. And I said, well, it doesn't have to be Shakespeare. And she went, what do you mean it doesn't have to be Shakespeare? I said, it doesn't have to be Shakespeare. She goes, oh, I was told it could only be Shakespeare. And I said, well, I don't know who told you that, but you could do anything you want. And I said, do you know anything that isn't Shakespeare? And she went, I think I might know something from Fried Green Tomatoes. And I thought, I'm in the Middle East, and someone knows something from Fried Green Tomatoes. So I asked her to get up, and she got up. And this was a really remarkable afternoon. And she did it, and it was very sort of presentational and kind of perfunctory, and she was quite aware of us, and it was all very stiff. But you listened to the content of what she was talking about, and it was quite powerful. So I sat her down, and I said, can you tell us what is the problem that this woman is facing? What is she going through? In your own words, just describe to us. And it's a piece about a woman who's being beaten by her husband lover, and they have a child, and she's afraid that he's going to start beating their child. And I said, okay, that's pretty powerful stuff. I said, what I'd like you to do is I want you to do it again. Only this time, don't think about presenting it to us, and don't even think about us. I just want you to connect to the emotions, and as much as you can, share with us your feelings. And she looked at me, and I said, you don't have to move. Just sit right where you are and just do it right from there. So she started it again, and this time she wasn't presenting it, she was talking, and at a certain point she had one line that she had only said once the first time she did it, and this time she said it 5 times, and every time she said it, she beat her fist, and the line was something like, and every time he beat me, I thought of God, and every time he beat me, I thought of God, and she welled up with tears, and I literally felt the entire room go. And she had this experience right in front of us in which she connected to the words and to what the story was and to what this woman was experiencing, and it was absolutely magical. And she finished, and I said to her, that was really beautiful. And everyone in this room could tell you why that was different for us. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us why that was different for you? And she said the most revealing thing about the way women are looked at. And she said, when you asked me to share my feelings, this is not something I'm ever asked.
Oh, wow.
And I was like, that's the problem with this place. And that's why arts and culture can be so powerful and extraordinary, particularly for women in places where women are treated like second-class citizens often. So that, for me, I mean, and then, strangely enough, 8 months later, I got a letter from her that she had moved to London and is studying to be an actress. And so that's not the purpose. That's not the, it's about that moment. It's about the fact that we were in this room giving her the attention and the detail and the chance to have an experience. And sometimes that's all it is. Sometimes it's that brief. It's something that person will never forget for the rest of their lives, and it fills them with a confidence that they never knew they were capable of. And that is what's extraordinary quite often about the kind of work that I'm able to do in these workshops, not just in America, but all over the world.
Thank you, Kevin. I mean, switching gears for one last question, if you're open to it.
Sure.
Would love to understand how you think about technology and how that's impacting the arts.
It's incredibly exciting what's happening right now. There's two things that seem to be happening simultaneously. Mm-hmm. One is this extraordinary burst of creativity, and the other is this remarkable thrust in new technology. Mm-hmm. And they are meeting at an intersection. And what that means is that technology is advancing in such ways that there are going to be all kinds of new ways in which people are going to be able to get entertainment and to provide entertainment. A lot of people thought I was crazy when I decided to do a television series with an online streaming company that had never done anything original content before. But I knew for about 8 years that it was going to be one of these companies. Right. It was either going to be Google or YouTube or Hulu or Netflix. Somebody was going to step up and say, why should HBO have the monopoly? If I'm going to be in this business and play this game, I'm going to have to compete. I never could have imagined that I would end up being a part of it, but nonetheless, it didn't surprise me that somebody did step up. And now, of course, we're seeing on the heels of the Netflix model and the success, lots of other companies, Amazon, Hulu, all these companies now stepping up and doing the original content. But we're now getting into another incredible area, which is new technology is going to give us an opportunity to experience entertainment, to experience worlds that are both virtual reality and 3D, and it's going to be up to us to both be open to the new emerging talents that are out there. Because what's been interesting to watch in the last number of years is there used to be all these walls that we built up in the entertainment industry to keep people out. If you weren't in LA or New York, you didn't have an agent, you didn't know somebody, you couldn't get in. But now the internet has completely opened up and democratized. Now there's no barrier to entry. Now we have to pay attention, those of us in the industry, to these new platforms, to these new talents, because otherwise they're going to keep self-producing, they're going to keep self-financing, they're going to keep self-publishing, they're going to do it themselves, not include us. Or we make the arena very fertile and very welcome. There's a lot of talent out there, and there's going to be a lot of technology that's just waiting for content. And the more content that is bought, the more writers are hired, the more directors are hired, the more actors are hired, the more it's better for our economy. Right. So I think there's going to be an extraordinary thing that's going to continue to happen over this next 10 years, where we're going to see a lot of exciting innovations that are going to come out of Silicon Valley, but I also think the Pacific Asian region is going to be also a major part of entertainment, both in terms of finance, but in terms of also storytelling. So I look at it all now and I go, wow, sometimes it feels like we're right on the forefront. But I also believe as long as there are people who have stories to tell and people who want to hear those stories, then the entertainment business is going to be doing just fine. Hi, I'm Kevin Spacey and a jackhammer. Welcome to Levo. I've enjoyed talking to you during business hours.
Thank you.
Can you do it as Frank Underwood?
No, you have to pay for that.